Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so grateful to be here, and it's wonderful to be in this room. It's got such a fabulous feeling, so thank you. So yesterday, the House of Representatives passed a bill. Did you see that?
Yes.
And now it will go to the Senate. But every American should be very clear about what this bill says, and also to really take in the fact that this bill was passed by a Democratic House. It's a continuation of the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, one progressive bone got thrown to us, a good thing, 12 weeks of paid family leave for federal workers who are civilian workers. That's a great thing. The whole country, I think, should have that. I think we should have that up to 3 months, and it should be fathers and mothers. So that's a good thing. But let's talk about what else this bill does. It establishes a sixth branch of the U.S. military. There will now be a sixth branch of the U.S. military called the Space Force. So you know when you're outside looking up at the stars, lying on the grass, maybe making love to somebody you know, that you love, you won't really know what's pointed back down at you. Those days will be over. Let me tell you what else this National Defense Authorization Act does. It actually increases permission for the president to get involved with what is now our aerial support, giving Saudi Arabia the help that they need to prosecute a war against Yemen, a genocidal war that has already starved tens of thousands of people. 85,000 children alone have starved because of this war. And the National Defense Authorization Act that passed by the Democratic House yesterday does absolutely nothing to limit the president's authorization to wage war, even when it comes to Iran. This is where we are today. If this is the best we can do with the Democrats, our country now has a government that is a fully owned subsidiary of the military-industrial complex. And this is not going to change unless the people wake up, the people rise up, and the people step in. But I'm only mentioning that particular instance because it's what's happening this week. It's not just the defense industry. It's the fact that we don't have universal health insurance yet, because that would cut into the profits for the health insurance companies and the big pharmaceutical companies. And we don't have the most reasonable, just reasonable gun safety legislation, because that would cut into the short-term profits for the gun manufacturers. And we have contaminants in our water. We have carcinogens in our food. We have toxins in our air. Because to do anything about those things any more than we already do would cut into the short-term profits for food companies, chemical companies, agribusiness companies, and oil and gas. And the NDAA that I mentioned was passed yesterday is just one example. We have a military that says how much money they say they need, and then we have hundreds of billions of dollars over and above that that has to do with what the defense industry says they want. Because any other action would cut into the short-term profits for the defense contractors. So it's a matrix. Defense, pharmaceuticals, health insurance, chemical companies, food companies, oil and gas, all of which have a place, but they have become a new aristocracy. This has been going on ever since the 1980s. Ever since the 1980s, when we became such a country of idolaters. You know, it's interesting. We started to make the businessman God. And as soon as we made the businessman God, it became almost inevitable that the most perverted, twisted image of one would rise up in our midst. Donald Trump did not create all of the problems that I just mentioned to you. Those problems created Donald Trump. And the idea that all we have to do is to defeat Donald Trump and everything's going to be okay is us living in such la-la land. If all we do is defeat Donald Trump, it's a good thing we won't fall over the cliff, and believe me, I'm as committed as the next person, as anyone I know, to making sure we do not have a second term of the Trump presidency. But if all we do is that, then we might not go over the cliff, but we'll still be way, way, way too much in the vicinity of the cliff. And if we're going to get out of the vicinity of the cliff, we have to have a much deeper conversation than the one we're having now. You see, the political establishment doesn't want us to really get down and get real. It's all about talking about the symptoms, and sometimes, particularly the Democrats, definitely have the best ideas for how to treat the symptoms. But just treating the symptoms is not enough. Because if you only treat the symptoms and you don't treat root causes, then those symptoms will simply morph into other symptoms, or the same symptoms will be back once somebody else is in power. But you see, the political establishment doesn't want us to have a deeper conversation about what really caused all these problems. Because if we were to really have a deeper conversation about what caused all these problems, we would see that they did. And so you see, this is the time for the American people to get really smart. And I've had a 35-year career working with people whose lives are in trouble. That's what I've done for 35 years. And this is what I've learned about the American people. We're smart. And in our personal lives, we don't like to be fooled. In our personal lives, we don't like it when somebody's crossing boundaries. In our personal lives, we don't like it when somebody's trying to pull the wool over our eyes. So why, collectively, are we willing to let this happen? We're not stupid. In no area of our lives do we act stupid. And yet when it comes to politics, we have all been trained to expect so little. We've all been trained to say pretty please about things that are what every citizen in a country as rich as ours should come to simply expect. And political establishment actually talks to us. Their operatives actually tell politicians to talk to us as though we were an average of 14 years old. But we're not 14. We're mature adults. And we need a politics of mature adults. Because mature adults don't let their House of Representatives establish a space force and not even talk about it the next day. But see, that's the way we work now, isn't it? We've become Stepford citizens. When I was young, there was that book, right, about Stepford wives. Stepford wives. We become Stepford citizens. We only talk about what we're supposed to talk about. We color within the lines. You know, when I was a child, my father wouldn't let me or my sister or my brother play with coloring books. Nobody's going to tell my kids how to draw the damn picture. They're not going to stay within the lines. You see, I grew up in a home where when I came home from the 7th grade, and I said that the social studies teacher had said that we had to be fighting in Vietnam, because if we weren't fighting in Vietnam, we would be fighting on the shores of Hawaii. And for those of you who aren't old enough to know or to remember, this was called the domino theory. It was that the United States had to fight the communists in Southeast Asia, because if we didn't fight them in Southeast Asia, they would continue turning all these countries communist, and ultimately we would be fighting them on the shores of Hawaii. And so, my father, in response to hearing that, I'm at the table, we're all sitting there, my brother, my sister, me, my mother. My teacher says that if we don't fight, I don't think you talk like that in the 7th grade, but anyway, my teacher says if we don't fight in Vietnam, we're going to be fighting on the shores of Hawaii. My father stands up, damn it, he said, that's it. Sophie Ann, and my father always called my mother sweetheart. So if he calls her Sophie Ann, he's really serious. Sophie Ann, get the visas, we're going to Vietnam. 1965, my father, all three of the kids, like something out of like, you know, Sound of Music or something, were all traipsing to Saigon. Because my father said he wasn't going to let the military-industrial complex eat his children's brains. And you know what? They didn't. That's why I'm running for president. But you know what? It's deeper, as I said, than just defense. And I think all of us need to have an understanding of how things got this way. Because it's just like when you go to therapy and you ask questions about your family and you start knowing, well, what did mommy or daddy or grandparents, when did they come here? Because when you know what your past is, when you know who you are in your lineage and in your line, if I know who my grandparents are, my great-grandparents are, it helps me understand who I am, where I stand in the midst of things. It helps me understand what I owe to my ancestors and also what I owe to my descendants. And there's a lot of that going on these days. We want to know what our personal history is. A lot of people, blacks want to know the history of blacks in America. Gay people want to know the history of gay people in America. Jews want to know the history of Jews. It's a good thing. This is not in any way to diminish any of that, because all of that's important. But there's a conversation I think we're not having enough of. And that's not just who we are as gay people, white people, black people, Jewish people, Christian people, Muslim people, who we are as Americans. That's a deeper story. You're black and you're American. You're Jewish and you're American. You're a woman and you're American. And that's the conversation that we're not having enough of today. And our story is glorious. Our story is glorious, but our story is tortured. And our story is one in which every generation writes its own chapter. And we've lost the plot here. We've lost our sense of psychological and emotional bonding to what the narrative is. What is this thing about? And so if you'll indulge me a little, I want to become, for just a couple of minutes, a little bit of an American history teacher. You know, over at Revelations Cafe, this was about a year ago, I was over at Revelations Cafe here in Fairfield, and they have in the back of the cafe a used book department, right? And I found all these books like American History for Dummies. All these like American history books that were like really, really simplified, which was really fabulous. So these books exist. We all know these things. But you know, we learned these things like when we were kids, and we either learned them from bored teachers or we don't remember them. So let's go over some of these things. You know, John Adams, our second president, said that he hoped that every July 4th, Americans would visit their first principles. Our first principles mean our mission statement. It's like when you go into a building of a company and they have the mission statement written on the walls. Because your mission statement is important. It's the principles on which you stand. Now, our mission statement are the principles of the Declaration of Independence. They're definitely inscribed on a lot of marble walls, and they're written on parchment and all of that, but they're not inscribed in our hearts the way they need to be right now. In the Jewish religion, it says, every generation must discover God for itself. You know, it's not enough that people really got the whole point of this thing in 1865. The point is, do we get the whole point of this right now? So I just want to go over a little bit of this with you because I think we've lost some of our rambunctiousness. We've lost the sense of the radicalism of the American experiment. And when you do that, you become easy to play. Number one, that all people are created equal. Number two, that God gave all men inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And then it gets really juicy here. It says that governments are instituted to secure those rights. And number four, if the government's not doing its job, it's the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. Yeah. Now, I'm not suggesting we abolish it. Damn right. I am suggesting we alter it. We alter it quickly. The time is now. Yes. Now, what was the whole point of the Declaration of Independence? Why did it even need to be written? It was written in order to repudiate an aristocratic system. The whole point of the radicalism of saying everybody's created equal, this was a radical statement. It was radical in 1776, and it's radical today. It was saying that there should not be just a small group. There should not be just a small group of really rich people who get everything at the expense of everyone else. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Here it was supposed to be that it didn't matter who you were, that you should have a shot at the life that was the actualization of your God-given potential. And that it would be the job of every generation to protect that very ideal. Now, that ideal is the most aspirational and enlightened set of principles that have ever been formed as the core of a nation. The problem is that even among those who signed the Declaration, 41 of them were slave owners. So that dichotomy is baked into the cake here. We've always been both. This is both sides of the American character. On one hand, we're these enlightened principles, and on the other hand, every generation, including ours, has had members and forces which represented the most violent, the most criminal even, transgression against those principles. That contest has always been with us. The issue is that every generation decides how it's going to play it. So we had slavery in this country, but remember, if you look at the narrative, we do tend to self-correct. We had slavery, but then we had abolition. We had the institutionalized suppression of women, but then we had the 19th Amendment and the establishment of the right of women to vote. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, but then we had the civil rights movement and the end of segregation. But let's look at how those things happen. Because none of those things happened because the government decided one day to make them happen. The government didn't wake up and say, let's end slavery. The government did not wake up one day and say, let's just give women the right to vote. Why not? And the government did not wake up one day and say, we really must dismantle segregation. That's not what happened. People rose up. People woke up. People rose up. People stepped up. And people stepped in. Now, we're not dealing with anything in our generation that other generations have not dealt with. We have the same level of assaults on everything that democracy is supposed to stand for. In our time, it's not centered in one evil institution. If it's centered in one evil institution, then it's like an operable tumor. There was slavery, you need to abolish it. Suppression of women, you need an amendment to give women the right to vote. Segregation, you need to dismantle it. This is more like a cancer that's metastasized. And it's wrapped around some healthy organs. It is simply an amoral economic perspective. It's not even immoral. It's amoral. It just doesn't, it is a virulent strain of capitalism. Now, I personally do not believe the problem is inherent in capitalism. Some people do, I actually don't. But it is a virulent strain of capitalism, which rose up in the 80s, and it proffers that corporations should have no tether to ethical or moral responsibility to people or to planet. It's the idea of short-term profit maximization without any soulfulness, without any ethics, without any morality. And what happened, that's bad enough, but then because of the unbelievable explosion of the money that those forces were able to use in order to wield influence in Washington, our government became over time simply a handmaiden to this amoral economic system. So that the idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people just went bye-bye. Because government became of, by, and for these huge multinational corporate forces and their short-term profit maximization. This is on our watch. So when those men died at Gettysburg, and Lincoln said that they had given the last full measure of devotion, that a government of the people and by the people and for the people would not perish from the earth. It's perishing now. It's perishing now. So we stand as a generation, as other generations have stood before us, facing some very serious challenges to everything that this country is supposed to stand for. And it's time, I believe, for us, and I believe we're more than ready. We've just been so systemically distracted, even by the political establishment that's supposed to be the container for the deeper inquiry. The establishment has itself been part of the distraction. You see, political establishment does not disrupt itself. A political establishment is a status quo that perpetuates itself. So our job is not so much different as other generations. The only question is, are we going to be the first one to wimp out on doing what it takes to put our country back on track? And if we continue in this la-la land of asking the very system that did this to fix this, who are we? What are we thinking? In ways that as individuals, we're too smart for that. This is not the way we live our lives. Now, this time, like I said, it's not as simple as just one institution to excise. It's a political and economic perspective that's more like a cancer that has metastasized, and it's wrapped itself around some very healthy organs. So, you got to be very careful. You don't want to blow up your government. You don't want to blow up your economy. You don't want to blow up corporations. You just need to be very, very thoughtful and see what's happening here. This has been going on for 40 years. And it has created a massive transfer of wealth. To me, that's called theft. Where not only the money, the major money of this country, but the major resources of this country, health, education, economic opportunity, it's not money itself. All of it's just been moved into the hands of too small a group of people. This is unsustainable. When you have 1% of Americans who own more wealth than the bottom 90%, the greatest income inequality since 1929, the complete decimation of our middle class. Now, people can still make money in America, and that's great. It's great that people can make money in America. The problem, however, not enough people can. And I don't think that the average person who creates wealth in this country wants to feel that their doing so is at the expense of other people having a chance. But let's make very clear, millions of people, for all intents and purposes, have no chance. We have 93 million Americans who live near poverty. Now, the politics that we need to create in the 21st century is not just from the neck up. We can't deeply understand where we are, where we've been, or where we need to go unless we open our hearts to a much more expanded sense of what all this is about. 93 million people. To say that people live in near poverty means that they live with chronic economic tension and anxiety every single day, not really knowing what will happen if they get sick, not really knowing what will happen if one of their kids gets sick, not knowing how they will be able to afford to send their kids to college, and how they will ever get out from under these college loans. This puts people in an emotional and a psychological straitjacket. Oh, and then we wonder where the mental health crisis came from. I love it when politicians are asked, how are you going to fix the mental health crisis? You know what I want to say to these guys? You might start by, stop driving everybody crazy. Because your policies do it. Your policies do it. We need a season of repair. And if you make me president of the United States, I'll tell you what we will do. We will repeal the 2017 $2 trillion tax cut, where 83 cents of every dollar went to the very richest corporations and individuals, put back in the middle class tax cut, because that should have been there to begin with, in my opinion. Secondly, we will stop these corporate subsidies, $26 billion to oil and gas alone last year. These people get what they pay for. Big pharmaceutical companies, for instance, lobbied Congress last year, $284 million. Oil and gas lobbied Congress last year, $125 million. It's not like these people don't get quid pro quos. They know what they're buying. Next thing we need to do is make sure that the United States government can negotiate for lower drug prices with big pharmaceutical companies. How can they give that away? Well, we know how they gave it away. They were paid to do so. Next, I would say to the U.S. military, what do you need? And I would be very, obviously, I want to know, why do you need that? My critique of the U.S. military is not a critique of the military, it's a critique of the politicians. You see, the military has to pick up all this mess and clean up all this mess that the politicians create. So I don't have a problem with the fact that we need a strong military, because I think we do. But we should look at the military like a surgeon. Should the United States have a good surgeon on hand just in case? Yeah, we should. But a sane person only has surgery if it's absolutely necessary. And we're learning more and more these days how many surgeries actually were not necessary because of all the lifestyle changes and dietary changes that would have made it unnecessary and would have had the absolute equal effect at treating or even reversing the disease. So all of the extra hundreds of billions of dollars that weren't what the military asked for, but that just what the defense contractors wanted, that should go away. But right now, that's going to be really hard. You see, because today, with that 6th military branch, oh, the champagne bottles are going off today. Oh, I bet they're having fun today. Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing. And I bet they paid a lot of money for that, too. But it's nothing compared to what they're going to get. They have a whole new branch. Now, we got to do some serious investigation, because in 1962, with the Test Ban Treaty, there was an agreement that no nuclear bombs would be in space. We need to be looking at that like a hawk or like a dove, however you want to say. So what we have is a situation. I also don't think there's any problem with asking billionaires for 3% tax on their assets, or for people with $50 million and more, that they should pay 2%. And I mention this because when we do those things, we're going to have cash on hand. And I want you to know what I would do with that if I were given the power. Number one, we have millions of chronically traumatized children. Just the other day in Perry, Iowa, a woman was telling me about the fact that she'd made these dolls. She made these big beanbag dolls to give to children at the border. She had some left over. She went to a school in Perry, Iowa, and she said, would you like these dolls? And the principal said, oh, we'd love to have them, thank you. We can put them in the trauma room. She said, the what? And they said, oh, it's a trauma room. It's what a lot of schools have now. Now that reminded me of a principal in Las Vegas, Nevada, who told me that she had in her school elementary school students on suicide watch. And then when I told that story last night in Council Bluffs, Iowa, I was told by a mother there whose children go to a very good school, a public school in Council Bluffs, that 84 children in the elementary school have mentioned suicide. We have vulnerabilities and challenges among our children today that are so huge, and they are an invisible sea of unnecessary human suffering. But you see, that violent strain of capitalism, it wants to squeeze the workers that it needs to get them as cheap as labor as they can, and it has no need for children, and has no need for older people. So what's happened to older people and children in our society? We should not be running this country like a business, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else. We should be running this country like a family. First, you take care of your children, you take care of your older people, then we'll talk about everything else. We need a mother in the Oval Office, and you can take that however you want. Yes. Now let's talk about what this means for these children. We have 13 million hungry children. We have 100,000 homeless children. This is trauma. Poverty is trauma. Hunger is trauma. You think a hungry child can learn? We have millions of American children who psychologists tell us experience a form of PTSD that is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. I read that it is believed that 40% of the girls who go to public school in Chicago public schools are considered to have PTSD. I'd like you to think for a moment about where you work, the business you work at. And then I want you to ask yourself, let's say you work in a coffee shop, or let's say you work in a lawyer's office, or let's say you work in a yoga studio. So imagine if there was now an established pattern of mass shootings at coffee shops, or an established pattern of mass shootings at law firms, or an established pattern of mass shootings at yoga studios. And ask yourself how work would be for you, whether or not that would not be with you every day on some level. And then ask yourself how it would feel if you were 12 years old and that was true. Are we having a conversation about this? We having even a conversation? Nah. Because the despair of America's children has simply been normalized. Why? Like I said, we're smart people. We need to stop thinking like 14-year-olds. We need to talk like smart people, which we are. The reason the despair of these children has simply been normalized by the political establishment is because they're not old enough to vote. They're not old enough to vote, so there's no constituency there. There are no votes there. Or they are the children of, most of them, in the situation that I just mentioned, are the children of the very, very poor who statistically don't vote a lot. Or because they're not old enough to work, there's no financial leverage there, so how could they possibly compete with all the clout of all that multinational corporate money in Washington? This is how rotten it has become. We need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need conflict resolution. We need restorative justice. We need mindfulness in the schools. If we really want an amazing economy 20 years from now, 15 years from now, 10 years from now, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take better care of our 10-year-olds today. Yes. There is nothing in the wind, and nothing in the sun, and nothing underneath the ground that can begin to compete with the power in a child's mind for the potential to generate the most amazing 21st century you can even imagine. It is our job to do, this is what you're supposed to do. People should not just live for ourselves, and generations should not just live for ourselves. We have a politics of people pleasing, where politicians are told before they go into events like this, ooh, black people might be here, so you should say this for the black people, that's what they want. This is what gay people want, so you should say this. This is what this group wants, so you should say that. That is part of the corruption. Our conversation should be, what does America need at this point? And what do we need to do in order that when we leave this earth, our democracy and our country and our world will be in a better place than the way we found it? That's the conversation we should be having. And so if you really want peace and you really want prosperity, which is a phrase politicians used to always use, but they don't even use it anymore because that's not the goal anymore. If you really want peace and you really want prosperity, I'll tell you where it is. in children's brains. That is where we need to be front-ending. We need to be front-ending our resources. And that's why we need an entire department of children and youth, because the vulnerabilities and the challenges of our children today far overwhelm our current capacities of something like the Department of Education and Health and Human Services to handle. Secondly, we should have a Department of Peace and not just a Department of Defense. You don't just take medicine, you cultivate health. Because sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. And you can't just endlessly prepare for war. How's this supposed to happen? I'm really curious about this. Are we going to just endlessly prepare for war and maybe someday that will back up into peace? Is that what we think? No, it's not when we think when we think about it. But we're not really, the political establishment, there's not really a lot of thinking about that, is there? So the issue is we can't just prepare for war. We also have to prepare for peace. We should have a national goal. This should be our goal. None of us will live to see it. Juliet, your little children will. Most of us won't. But we want to imagine that at the end of this century, either war has been eliminated, or at the least, humanity is in a place where reasonable people can see it coming down the road. We don't just need war games, we also need peace games. If we want peace, we need to start planning for peace. We need to wage peace. Even Donald Rumsfeld said that, and he was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush. We need not only a military academy, we should also have a peace academy. Because war is the absence of peace. Peace isn't the absence of war. And you know what? We know how to wage peace. There are 4 factors which, when present, statistically indicate there will be greater incidence of peace and a lower incidence of conflict. You expand education for children, expand economic opportunities for women, reduce violence against women, and ameliorate unnecessary human despair. It's a big duh, isn't it? Yeah. We should see all desperate people, large groups of desperate people, are a national security risk. Large groups of desperate people become a petri dish out of which social dysfunction is inevitable. Desperate people become more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. When you have large groups of desperate people, of course there are going to be gangs. You have large groups of desperate people, of course there are going to be mental health issues. You have large groups of desperate people, of course there's going to be vulnerability to terrorist organizations. But we're so busy treating the symptoms, we're not looking at all the ways in which we don't nip these things in the bud before they even have a chance to grow big, because we don't want to nip them in the bud, because the government is acting more at the behest of funding the problem creators than funding the problem solvers. We really need to step in now and to think that that system is going to repair itself. That system is not going to repair itself. It is time for the American people to wake up and to rise up and to step in. And whenever those people talk about how someone is outside, I love it. Somebody said to me the other day, but you're an outsider candidate. I said, outside what? Outside what? This country was not supposed to be founded with this political elite. It's a corporate, the whole country is being run by a corporate aristocracy, and then you have this political establishment that's like a corporate elite within a larger corporate elite. And it's very, very nice people, by the way. And that's true of some of these corporate chieftains. This is not about individuals. This is about a system. And it's very important that we make the distinction. All the people who are running for the Democratic nomination, I have tremendous respect. I don't have tremendous respect, but I have respect for all of them. And a few of them, deep affection. And they're all telling you the truth. This is not, nobody's lying to you. They're all telling you the truth. What I'm saying to you is that we're living at a time in our history where we need to think what happens when you go into a court of law and you raise your hand. You don't just swear to tell the truth. You swear to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And that's what America needs now. America needs to look in the mirror. We need to take a brutally honest look at ourselves. Until we do that, we will not transform. And what I've done for 35 years with people is worked with people to take that brutally honest look in the mirror. And when you do, we see the things that really need to transform here. And they're not just on the level of an incremental change here or an incremental change there, or one policy here or one policy there. We need a fundamental pattern disruption of the social, political, and economic principles that now dictate American public policy. We need to change from an economic to a humanitarian bottom line. We do not need to have a bottom line of public policy, that which supports short-term profit maximization for corporations. We need American public policy, both domestic and international, to be guided by one principle: what would help people thrive? Because that which helps people thrive helps people spread their wings. That which helps people thrive helps people be there for their families, raise their children because they have the bandwidth to do so. When you think of all the Americans, when you just even think about what will happen when we have completely universal health care, and my plan is called the whole health plan, because it's not just universal health care. Oh, it's universal health care, but it goes deeper than that. Because I want to do more than provide health care. I want to provide greater opportunities for health. I want to ask, why is it that Americans are so sick compared to other countries that have comparable wealth? Well, the answer is pretty clear if you look at it. The contaminants in our water, the carcinogens in our food, the toxins in our air. McDonald's can't make the same French fries in France that it makes here, because France is more protective of its food supply. We have to look at the oil and gas and the toxins that are in our water. We have to look at the fact we've sold out to chemical companies so that all the pesticides and the fertilizers that we know do harm to a child's brain. And we have to look at the fact that so many of our economic policies, because they cause such stress in so many people, stress itself is an indicator of the probability of disease. And we need to recognize that our entire healthcare system, the conversation that is going on now, has to do with how we're going to pay for it. I'm interested not only in how we're going to pay for it. Number one, I'm interested in why so many are sick. And number two, what is the treatment we're paying for? Because right now, even in the healthcare systems that provide the most universal health care, it's still dictated by pharmaceutical and surgical options. But we're now living at a time when it is statistically proven how often lifestyle changes and dietary changes, and in this town you certainly know how much certain lifestyle changes, including things like meditation, actually are beneficent and actually increase the functioning of the immune system. Recently, there was something that came out just in the last few weeks about stents. We now know that stents, heart stents, we all know people have had stents. We now know they've proven that certain dietary changes and lifestyle changes are just as effective as our stents. So in my health care plan, in my whole health care plan, when you go to the doctor and you are diagnosed, it is mandated that you also be informed that the doctor might be telling you about the pharmaceutical option or the surgical option, which, given the makeup at American medical schools today, that's probably what they were mainly educated in, because most doctors in medical schools today only get a semester, even just a semester of education in the relationship between food and disease. And so it will be mandated that when you are told that you have a sickness that you are shown on the internet or wherever, this is what the scientifically proven option is, and you can see for yourself statistically which way you choose to go, and insurance has to pay for either one. These are the kind of fundamental changes we need. We don't need a little bit here. We need an entirely different orientation to war and peace. We need an entirely different orientation to children. We need an entirely different orientation to sickness and health. We need an entirely different orientation to our environment. And I don't need to tell anybody in Iowa what's going on with agribusiness and how the farming sector has been decimated. I don't think anybody in Iowa needs me to remind you how many farmers are going bankrupt, how many farmers are committing suicide. I don't think anybody in Iowa needs to be informed what happened in the 1980s. How before the 1980s, if a farmer had a bad year, it was very likely that the bank was on their side. The bank would say, we know we had a bad year, that's okay, come back next year. Instead, the banks are on the side of agribusiness. Farming in Iowa and so many other states is controlled by huge corporate conglomerates of people who've never been here, they've never walked this land, they've never held the dirt in their fingers, and we need to stop those animal factory farms. They are immoral. They are immoral. They are immoral to the end, and they are so unhealthy for us. The runoff, I'd read this article, not long after I read the article, I was sitting on an airplane next to a man who is a doctor at the National Institute of Health. And he was talking about how the big thing going on there is they are terrified of what's coming down the road in terms of bacteria that are drug resistant. We have so many antibiotics now in our water, and a lot of this is from those factory farms. So many antibiotics in our food, so many antibiotics in the water. that now there are antibiotics that doctors assumed even 10 years ago, well, if nothing else, that'll kick it out? And nobody's too sure anymore at all. You see, we're like in this country, and then you look at, of course, the fact that if we don't have a World War II level mass mobilization to reverse climate change, from a dirty economy to a clean economy. And once again, we know what we need to do. We know we need to sequester the carbon. We know we need to reforest. We know we need to get very, very quickly with a Green New Deal type of investment in all of the clean energy systems. We know we need to get rid of the animal factories, because we know that if we don't, the nitrous oxide and the methane gas would do us in, even if we didn't do the other. We know that if we do not do this in 7 years, that we could have a massive social collapse, unlike anything in the modern era. Whole swaths of countries and continents that are not uninhabitable because of the heat. And if it's uninhabitable because of the heat, you can't grow food there. And if you can't grow food there, you're going to have food shortages. You're going to have economic collapse. And we could have hundreds of millions of environmental refugees. We've already got the Amazon burning. We've already got what's going on in Antarctica. You've already got the death of the coral reefs. How far does this have to go? Because what's happening is we're like frogs in a boiling water. And what's happening is we all know it's hot and we even know it's boiling, but we get it every time they turn up the temperature. Oh, so it's the coral reefs. Oh, so it's a Space Force. Oh, they're killing Jews. I mean, it's like every day there's something that, what do you mean they were killing Jews at a kosher market? What do you mean? What did you say? It's like ho-hum. At this point, even when they impeach the president, and we're kind of like, our outrage factor, our senses have been dulled. Our sense of moral outrage has been dulled. We've been exhausted. Even 2 years ago, the main emotional tenor was rage. Now, even the rage is suppressed, and it's just exhaustion and desensitization. And you know how we have to be with each other? We have to be with each other. You know, when you read about people who went mountain climbing and there was an avalanche or something, and the danger is that somebody's going to freeze to death. And they tell you when you take classes in these things that what you can't let your friends do is fall asleep. Because if somebody falls, that's how people die in those situations. So if you and I were on a mountain and it was cold and we hadn't been rescued yet, and you said, well, I'm just going to take a nap, the people are like, no, you can't go to sleep. That's how we have to be. We can't go to sleep. And let me tell you something just to end this. And then we can talk about whatever you want. President Trump is not just a politician. President Trump is a phenomenon. And we also, another place where we need to get out of la-la thinking and magical thinking is if you think that we're going to be able to beat him with just traditional political conversation. This man will be coming at us with Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica, it's renamed, but it's the same group, the same people. Cambridge Analytica is a military-grade propaganda weapon. It was developed for warfare. It employs shadow mining. Data mining that comes from very shadowy forces, and its capacity to propagandize and to trigger and to manipulate is beyond what most of us can even imagine. We're going to have that. We're going to have the narcissism and the shamelessness that we know. We're going to have the power of incumbency. All that's going to be coming at us. Some big lies are going to be coming at us, ladies and gentlemen, and I submit to you, the only thing that's going to be powerful enough to override big lies is some really big truth. We need some radical truth telling, because just kind of sort of the truth, yeah, it's the truth, but it's not the whole truth. That's not going to carry the power that we need. What we're going to have coming at us is a phenomenon, and we need to be our own phenomenon. But on our side, we don't believe one person is the phenomenon. We don't think that way. The phenomenon that we need is the American people who do what American people have done throughout history. And you know, Winston Churchill, he said that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. It is true, sometimes we get there late. And to be honest, it's late right now. Sometimes we do get there late, but anybody who knows history also knows that when we do get there, we slam it like nobody's business. We do not have time to tarry. We don't have time to just have a more elevated conversation. We're way too close to the cliff for that. We need an awakening of the American people that is as brilliant as what happened with abolition, as brilliant as what happened with the women's suffragette movement, as brilliant as what happened with the civil rights movement. Anything less than that, and yes, we're all going to work really hard. Dear God, we will defeat Donald Trump next year. But that will not be enough. If that's all we do, those same forces will be back in 22, and those same forces will be back big time in 24. We need to have something much bigger going on. We have to have a wave of collective energy of the American people when we're at our best. And we look at forces that would erode our democracy and undermine our good. And we say with elegance, and we say with style, and we say with kindness, stop right there. And to any systems of tyranny, and a corporate aristocracy is what other generations would call tyranny, we need to say in the nicest way, hell no, that stops now. Thank you. Fairfield. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That is so sweet of you. Thank you. Thank you.